Welcome, everyone. Sit back and enjoy the story of Two Sweet Souls, written and narrated by Pamela Gillette. Josiah was fishing in the lake near the cemetery, and Patience was picking wildflowers nearby when they saw two little girls ride up on their bikes and get in the paddle boat. One of the little girls began to notice them. They could tell she was going to wave to them until she realized that they were a bit transparent. The little girl was Molly O'Neill. She and her family had moved out to the country that summer. Molly had the ability to glimpse into the spirit world, and she could see Patience and Josiah, but she knew her friend could not see them, so she quietly acknowledged them when her friend wasn't looking. Patience and Josiah had waited almost 60 years in the shadows to find someone like Molly who could help them tell the story of their deaths. They had stayed close to their graves all these years. When their parents eventually died and were buried in the cemetery, they wanted to tell them the story, but their spirits had already crossed over. Patience and Josiah had unfinished business. They needed someone to give their brother Jacob a message. The cemetery was privately owned and on the Campbell farm. The farm had been in the family for 2 generations, so many family members, friends, and neighbors were buried there. It was a quiet place surrounded by fields and wildflowers. To the side of the cemetery was the lake, equipped with a nice dock, a paddle boat, and a canoe pulled up on the bank. Patience and Josiah's last name was Charlin. Their farm was down the country road from the Campbells, closer to the country schoolhouse, but still a bit of a walk to and from school through the woods, fields, and around their own large lake. The year they attended the country school was 1902. The time the story was told was the autumn of 1961. A few weeks after Patience and Josiah saw Molly for the first time, the Campbells were going to host a huge costume party, bonfire, and hayride for friends and neighbors who lived for miles around on County Road. They wanted to go to the party and blend in with the other children wearing costumes. Patience thought it would be the perfect opportunity to see Molly and possibly talk to her. They could see the glow and smoke from the bonfire, so they left the cemetery and walked the short distance to the Campbell house. They watched people roasting hot dogs and yearned to join in the fun. They appeared as 2 small children dressed in old-fashioned clothes and whose mother painted their hands and face white and drew dark circles around their eyes. Of course, it wasn't makeup. Dozens of people were milling around the party, so they blended right in. They stood by the fire and tried to be inconspicuous. They saw a man roasting some hot dogs who seemed very familiar. Patience and Josiah hadn't aged, but soon they realized when someone called him Jacob that it was their brother. He had gray hair by now and seemed very old to them. He was roasting hot dogs for his grandchildren. Lots of time had passed. Jacob looked at them and seemed to become very sad. He finished cooking his hot dogs and left the bonfire to sit at a picnic table next to his wife. They chose a table with other adults, including Molly's mother and father. Molly and a friend sat at a card table, close enough so they could hear the adult conversation. Jacob couldn't shake the strange sadness that he was feeling. He looked over at the bonfire and said, "Those 2 children over there remind me so much of my brother and sister. The tragedy happened decades ago, and it wasn't your fault," his wife said. "What happened to them?" Molly's dad asked. Jacob took his wife's hand and began to tell a story. "We all went to the little school on the hill. My brother and sister were younger than me, but in those days we were all in the same classroom. We had a Christmas party the last day of school before our winter break. I remember it perfectly. We had cookies and candy canes, and we exchanged little gifts. I got a pocket knife from a friend who drew my name. I'll never forget Josiah's face when he ran up to me and showed me the bag of marbles he got from John Doyle. Patience was right behind him. She was so pretty and sweet. She showed me some warm purple mittens she got from Lucy Doyle. I'm sure her mother made them herself. My brother and sister were so happy and such nice kids. As soon as we were dismissed, I ran out the door. It was snowing again, and there were already a couple of inches on the ground. Anyway, I didn't wait and walk home with them. When I got home, I ran inside and showed Mom and Dad my new pocket knife. Then I went out to do chores. Mom thought Patience and Josiah were with me because when I came back in the house, they asked me where my brother and sister were. I told them they weren't with me. My Mom and Dad panicked. Dad ran outside and called them. He ran back in to get his coat and hat and lit a lantern. We went out to search for them. The snow had covered any footprints there would have been. We got back to the house and Dad saddled up our horse and rode to the neighbors looking for the kids. No one had seen them since they left the school. The neighbors organized a search party. Our neighbor had 2 bloodhounds. We all went back to our house to get some of their clothes so the dogs could get the scent. Are you sure you want to tell this, Jacob? You get so upset, his wife said. What, do you want to hear the story? Jacob asked Molly's mom and dad. Mom looked over at Molly and Mary. She thought they were talking to their friends and not listening to the adult conversation. She wanted to make sure they weren't listening, so she said, "Just a minute, Jacob." She turned to the girls and said, "I want you kids to go play. You don't need to listen to us." "Okay," they grumbled and walked over to the bonfire. "Well, you can't stop now. We have to hear how this story ended," Mom said. "Okay then, here goes." We followed the dogs to our lake. One of the dogs rooted in the snow and found a purple mitten. My dad put it in his pocket. The dogs turned and waited to go through the woods toward the road, but one of the men shined his lantern at the edge of the lake. A very thin layer of ice was forming on the lake, and through the ice he thought he saw a hand. He yelled for help, and several men stepped into the lake, breaking the thin ice. They pulled out Patience and Josiah. Patience was hugging Josiah, Jacob said, with tears in his eyes. We never knew how they drowned in the lake, especially in only 3 feet of water. Mom looked at her friend Paul and said, "Remember the souvenirs John Doyle had in the ceiling of the farmhouse? I remember you telling me about a bag of marbles, or am I mistaken?" Earlier that summer, Molly and her family had uncovered several murders a local farmer named John Doyle had committed. He had been dead now for several years. No one ever knew he had committed any crimes. During the investigations, the sheriff found, with the help of Molly O'Neill, a space in the roof of John Doyle's porch where he had hidden his souvenirs. Some of the souvenirs were articles of clothing, bones, and there was a bag of marbles. The sheriff still held some of the articles from the unknown murders. They included a purple mitten and a bag of marbles. Molly hadn't heard the story Jacob told. She and her little friend ran off to play games. Patience and Josiah didn't hear it either. The 2 children decided that the party was too crowded, so they faded off into the shadows and went back to the cemetery. The next evening, Molly and her sister Mary, who could see spirits also, were sitting at the picnic table, talking to a young spirit who had possessed a scarecrow. His name was Moses. Molly asked him, "Moses, do you know the 2 little ghosts named Patience and Josiah?" "Yes, I do. They're buried in Campbell Cemetery." "Look over there by the tree, Molly," Mary said. Patience and Josiah were standing a few feet away. They were holding each other's hands and watching the kids. "Come over here," Molly said as she waved them over. They came over, and Molly told them, "Your brother's all grown up now. Why are you staying around here? Why haven't you crossed over?" "Patience," answered Molly. "No one ever knew what really happened to us. The awful boy was never punished, and he took back the Christmas presents he gave Josiah." "Tell us what happened to you." Patience told the story. "We had fun at the Christmas party at school. After the party was over, teacher dismissed us. We stayed for a couple of minutes to help her clean up the room. Her ride came to take her home, and she asked us if we wanted a ride. We knew it was out of her way, so we told her we were going to cut through the woods like we always did. The other children were already gone. We walked around the back of the school and to the path in the woods. Joshua thought he heard twigs breaking near our path. I told him it was probably squirrels. We came to the clearing on the side of our lake, and we heard John Doyle call us. He told us he wanted to see the Christmas presents we got at the party. I was wearing my pretty purple mittens, so I showed him my hands. He told me my mittens were a stupid present, and he wanted to see the marbles he gave Josiah. He called my brother Joe. I told him my brother's name was Josiah, not Joe. He told me to shut up, and he pushed me down. Josiah took the marbles out of his pocket and said, "You gave these to me." John told Josiah he wanted his marbles back. I yelled for Josiah to run home. John caught up with him and hit him on the top of his head with his fist. Josiah fell to the ground, and John turned him over and took the bag of marbles out of his pocket. I ran to Josiah, and he wasn't moving. John pushed me away and picked up Josiah and threw him in the lake. I screamed and got up and ran for the lake. John caught me by the back of my coat and threw me on the ground. He took off my mittens and said, "You won't need these anymore." I got up and jumped in the lake to get Josiah. I was trying to pull him out when John got a big stick and used it to push me back in the lake. I begged him to help me, and all he did was mock me. He hit me on top of my head with his fist and pushed me under the water with Josiah. I hugged Josiah before I passed out and died. John went home and acted like nothing ever happened. Everyone had tears in their eyes. Molly asked, "What do you want us to do so you and Josiah can rest in peace?" "I want my brother to know what happened to us, and I want the other pretty purple mitten and the bag of marbles put on our graves in the cemetery. Most of all, I want my brother to know that we don't blame him for anything. We're glad John Doyle didn't kill him too, and he was able to grow up and have children of his own," Patience said. "We'll tell your brother what you said. And our friend Paul, he knows the sheriff. He'll get your mitten and the bag of marbles. We'll make sure your brother puts them on your graves. I'm going in and tell my mother," Molly said, as she wiped the tears from her eyes. Molly and Mary ran in and told their mother the whole story. She called her friend Paul and told him everything the girls had heard. "I have the mitten and the bag of marbles from Doyle's Souvenirs. The sheriff told me there was no reason to keep the items. The case was closed. It's only 5 o'clock now. I think those children have waited long enough. I'll call the Charlins and tell Jacob how his brother and sister really died," Paul said. "I'll tell them we're going to the cemetery with the mitten and the marbles. I'll call everyone else and tell them to bring all their lanterns and flashlights. I'll meet you at the cemetery at 6 o'clock. That should give everyone time to get there." Molly's older brother Adam was listening to the story along with her dad and her older sister Maggie. "I remember seeing those 2 kids at the party," her brother said. "I want to go to the cemetery." "I do too," Maggie said. "I can't believe the horrible way they died." The O'Neill family went to the graveyard. The Charlins and all the Campbells showed up because Paul called them and told them the story. Paul brought the mitten and the bag of marbles and handed them to Jacob Charlin. It was a very touching scene with all the people in the cemetery holding lanterns and flashlights. Jacob told everyone his parents had buried Patience with the one mitten they found at the side of the lake. He said, "We know what really happened to my brother and sister, so now they can rest in peace. I'm placing these objects on the two little graves as a symbol of our love for them. They will continue to be missed as long as I live." He spoke about his sister and brother for a few minutes. When Jacob was finished speaking, Molly walked up to him and said, "Patience and Josiah did not blame you for their deaths. They were glad you grew up and had children of your own. They wanted you to know who was responsible for their deaths and what happened to them. They love you and want you to be happy, and then they will cross over." Jacob looked at Molly with tears running down his cheeks and said, "Thank you." He walked over to his wife, and she hugged him. Molly looked down at the glove and the marbles, and they slowly disappeared. She smiled and looked beyond the graves. She saw Patience smiling and waving, with Josiah standing next to her. Patience held up her hands, wearing both mittens, and Josiah raised his hand and showed Molly the bag of marbles. Molly waved to them, and they disappeared. These two beautiful souls were finally at peace. After almost 60 years of wandering in the shadows, Patience and Josiah were free to cross over. But wait, I have a bonus for you. In Book 1, Molly O'Neill, Witches, Fairies, and Saddle Oxfords. John Doyle kept a journal. We have an entry here that finally makes Patience and Josiah's death make sense. John Doyle wrote, December 1902. I don't know how those two little kids fell in the lake. Yes, I do. I pushed them idiots. The kid should have given me the marbles when I asked for them. Their parents should have taught them to swim. Help me, help me. Why didn't she yell, help us? She pulled her own brother down, trying to save herself. I guess the freezing weather didn't help. Oh well, Ma had warm milk waiting for me when I got home. I wonder when the Charlins are going to miss those two little kids. If you're brave enough, you can read Molly O'Neill, Witches, Fairies, and Saddle Oxfords, and see what happens to John Doyle. See if his death was really an accident. See you next time. Bye.